What's up?
Excuse me, I don't think you uploaded the file. Like you usually
What
do.
file?
That one. The irrepressible conflict.
I posted it on Canvas this morning.
You did?
Yep.
Okay, I'll check.
Good morning. Before I start today's lecture, I want to introduce you to Hallie Herzog. She is with the You Teach program, and she's going to take just a few minutes to talk to you about the program. Now, some of you may have no interest in this. That's okay. But some of you might find that you're very interested. So please be respectful of those who might be interested and don't talk.
Hi y'all, my name is Hallie and I'm here from You Teach. You Teach is our middle school and high school STEM teaching certification program here at UT, and it allows you to graduate with the current degree that you're working on and then also your teaching certificate. So I'm a math major, and when I graduate, I'll graduate with my math degree, and then I'll also be able to go straight into teaching high school math. So even though I'm a math major teaching math, you do not have to get certified in your major. So I have friends who are history majors or Japanese majors, psychology majors, and they're all getting certified to teach either math or science. So it's open to all majors. And this certification program consists of 8 courses. The first 2 courses in that sequence are called Step 1 and Step 2. The codes for that are UTS 101 and UTS 110. So in Step 1, that's UTS 101, you get to write and teach lessons to elementary school students. So it's a great way to really figure out if teaching is something that you might be interested in. It's very low risk. All you have to do is sign up, take the class. There's no obligation to finish the program with that class. It's just a great way to get some teaching experience and figure out if teaching is something that you're interested in. In that next class, Step 2, it's very similar to Step 1, but this time you're in the middle school, so you get to write and teach lessons to middle school students. So the You Teach program also offers scholarships and internships that are available that first semester in the program. So as a Step 1 student, you are able to get an internship and apply for scholarships within the program. So those are some great opportunities we have in that program. So You Teach also has another branch that's separate from the certification program. So we also have something called You Teach Outreach, and this is like our community outreach branch. So this is not to get certified to teach after you graduate. This class is just a 1 3-hour class, and it allows you to teach lessons that are given to you to middle school and elementary school students in the Austin area as like a little bit of community outreach. So this class may count for like a chem lab or something else depending on your major. You would just have to talk to your advisor to figure that out. So this is a great way to earn course credit, to earn some credit while doing some community service and getting some fun teaching experience. So are there any questions about either the certification program or You Teach Outreach? Well, if there's no questions right now, we have, if you just Google You Teach Austin, there's a lot of information on the website, and I'll also be leaving some flyers up here that you can grab on your way out with some more information. If this sounds like something you're interested in, go ahead and sign up for Step 1, that's UTS 101, and start getting some experience. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Hallie. Okay, let me get these 2 files posted. The outline, I thought this had already happened. I thought I'd already done it. Let me get the outline and the PowerPoint transferred from file. Well, that's there. Why wasn't that there? Oh, there's so much I don't understand in this world. All right, let's go back. Wait a minute.
today, so I couldn't come. But I wanted to ask, next week I have like 3 tests, so I don't think that I would be able to come to your office hours on Wednesday. But I wanted to ask, like, are you available to come in on Monday, or is that too much?
Wait just a minute.
I'm sorry.
I don't understand what's going on here. All I'm trying to do.
I would offer to help, but I'm very bad at technical stuff. I'm sorry.
Well, this is what I've done every class period, all semester long. Okay. Here's 2 things. I am going to be in my office for some time. I don't know how long. After class on Monday.
Okay.
Also, Ian Green is going to Wednesday because the lecture's not going to take the whole 50 minutes. He's going to do a little question and answer and review, and so you may not need anything from me at all.
That's debatable. But I have a meeting on Monday at 1, but I can definitely like go with you to your office right after class and then
Okay.
talk to you for that hour.
All right.
And then leave.
Okay.
So that it works out perfectly.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So Monday after class. See you then, doctor. Or you know.
All right. Okay, I'm finally ready to start. I was talking to you on Wednesday. About the significance in the first half of the 19th century of the second 2-party system, the Whigs and the Democrats, both trans-regional parties. And I talked with you about how both of them essentially fell apart. Because of sectional tensions in the 1850s. I had talked about the Whigs, I was talking about the Democrats, and I got to the point where I was about to start talking about the Democratic National Nominating Committee in 1860, where a political party gets together to nominate a candidate to run representing that party for President of the United States. All right. So the Democratic Party had its first nominating convention in Charleston, South Carolina in 1860. They were seriously divided. They were unable to come to any agreement on anything. So the convention delegates just packed up and left. A second convention was attempted at Baltimore, but with no better luck. They just could not agree. They could not agree on a candidate. They certainly couldn't agree on a platform. Finally, the Democratic Party gave up the attempt. They said, we're just not a national party any longer. And so there were 2 separate conventions. The Northern Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas, and the Southern Democrats nominated John C. Breckinridge. Now, that means that there are 3 parties that are putting forward nominees for president in 1860. The third party, when there are three parties, this happens in Europe all the time. They have several parties, not just two. But in the United States, what usually happens, or what can happen, is that if all three of the parties are going to pull down a significant section of the vote, or if two of the parties, like the Northern Democratic Party and the Southern Democratic Party, they're just going to be Democrats, and then there's the Republican Party that's just Republican, you can see that having two Democratic Party is going to put the Democratic candidates at a disadvantage. And that is one, not the only, but that is one reason that the Republican candidate, Abraham Lincoln, so handily won the 1860 election. That and the fact that in the South there were 4 states that did not even put his name on the ballot. Okay, now, what I'm talking about for the rest of the lecture, that's not next. Okay, the two Republican candidates. All right, all right. What I'm talking about for the rest of the lecture was this conflict that became a civil war, the first modern war. And when Eric Foner makes that claim, this is the first modern war, what does he mean by that? You need to notice that. What made it the first modern war? And what made it an irrepressible conflict? That's what I'm talking about today. And I'm going to talk about the North's perspective on itself. How did Northerners see themselves? How did they see their region? How did they see the South? And then I'll talk about how did Southerners see themselves? How did they see their region? How did they see the North? William Seward, who was a Republican, he delivered a speech in October of 1858. This is 2 years before the election. And he said, "It is," meaning the conflict between the two sections, the two regions, "it is an irrepressible conflict." Do you know what irrepressible means? What does it mean? You can't push it down. It keeps coming back up. You can't push it down. It's irrepressible. It is an irrepressible conflict between opposing and enduring forces. And it means that the United States must and will, sooner or later, become entirely a slaveholding nation or entirely a free labor nation. Okay. Seward's ominous words. Now, as we studied the social and economic development of the two regions from the late 18th century through the antebellum decades, we've learned about the two different economies. We've learned about the different paths of economic development of the two regions and the related social order, and how the social order it wasn't exclusively an artifact of economic development and economic arrangements, but in large part it was an artifact or a result of the particular economic arrangements of that region. And by 1830, we can note that the North and South are clearly moving in opposite directions, not only in attitudes towards slavery, that's of course true, but also in the lifestyle, to use that tired word of their societies. One region gradually but persistently had abandoned slavery, and one region became more committed to slavery between the 1790s and 1860. All right? Remember, in the 1790s, Southerners who owned hundreds of slaves were absolutely willing to concede. Yes, it's a terrible thing, but it's a necessary evil. By 1830, it was a positive good. We take care of these people. What would they do without us? And yes, on the face of it, well, it's very disingenuous. On the face of it, it's a justification for immoral behavior, but people really believed this. And that's what we have to take seriously. So from what we've learned, what was the fundamental source of sectional conflict? Some have argued that essentially what you have here is two very different civilizations. And so of course they weren't going to get along. One was based on agriculture and directed towards maintaining a static, traditional, somewhat conservative pattern of rural living with ownership of a farm, even a plantation, as the highest social goal. The other region was understood to be based on commerce and industry as well as commercial agriculture, and committed to mobility, rapid change, social dynamism, and the attainment of financial wealth or well-being, rather than land ownership as the ultimate goal. And then the two regions, and you can follow this on the outline, the two regions differed in terms of federalism versus state sovereignty. Now, think about this. Federalism is a system where there is a national government and a state government, and they work together. And a federalist nation was created with the Articles of Confederation. But throughout the 1780s, there was one problem after another problem, and the nation was terribly in debt. And so, a number of very prominent men, heroes of the Revolution, decided, okay, something's got to change. And they met in 1787, and they talked about what the problems were, and they said, well, the national government has to be stronger than the state governments. There have to be certain functions that are exclusive to the national government, like printing currency. We can't have every state printing currency and call ourselves a nation. There have to be some functions that are exclusive to the national government, like foreign policy. It doesn't make sense for all these different states to singularly conduct their foreign policy, and so on and so forth. And so these men talked about, okay, what things does a nation do that would be better handled by a central government? And what things could state governments better do in terms of organizing, managing, creating policy for, et cetera, the people within their state? Well, they'd be better at creating educational systems within that state. They'd be better at collecting taxes within that state. They'd be better at all sorts of things that are laws particular to that state and the people that live in that state. And those things, well, it makes sense for the state governments to do and for the national government to stay away from. So, there were the ratifying conventions. And of course, the people that called themselves the Anti-Federalists were horrified by this. They said, you're doing away with state sovereignty, with the states being their own government over their own people. And that's going to create a too powerful national government, which will end up reigning in tyranny over all of us. We cannot do that. They felt very passionate about that. Some were persuaded, well, look, if we have a Bill of Rights, if we do this, if we do that, what do you think? Okay, well, in every single, not in every single one, but in 9 out of 12 of the ratifying conventions, the people at the convention voted, yes, let's go with this new Constitution. And so that's what they did. Now, at that moment, the men who had spent the summer together in 1787 and written this new Constitution, let's say James Madison, these men felt like what they had accomplished was, okay, we've moved away from state sovereignty. When every state was king of the mountain, that just didn't work in creating one nation. So states are sovereign over their little patch, but the national government is sovereign over all the states. So, to the extent that in the 1850s, and actually, this had been quarreled about since the 1790s, to the extent that federalism meant a stronger national government, but enabled important state governments the people at the convention in 1787 thought, well, we've solved that. There's no more state sovereignty. We don't have to deal with that anymore. Here it is. Here it is in the nullification crisis. In the Kentucky and Virginia Resolution. And that was Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. There are people asserting that a particular state has the right to nullify a national law. Okay, what was the Constitution and the ratifying conventions? What was all that about? This is vexing. This is very vexing. Because it appeared to be all solved. And as a matter of fact, although the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, or the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans disagreed over the bank, and they disagreed over the Alien and Sedition Acts. And then as time goes on, people disagree over internal improvements, and this and that and the other. Things were, in fact, working pretty well. Of course there were disagreements about foreign policy, about trade policy, yada, yada, yada. But it was working pretty well. Because except for a few outlying ideologues, like John Calhoun, no one was, until the 1850s, behaving as if they really believed in state sovereignty, as opposed to federalism, where the national government is united and stronger, is an umbrella over the states, but each state has its own powers regarding the state. That had been solved, right? Well, in 1858, a lot of people would say, no, that hadn't been solved. We want to be assured that our state has the right, meaning Congress does not have the right, and you know what it was? That our state has the right to create slave codes, and that Congress does not have the right to eliminate slavery from any territory, to forbid the introduction of slavery into any territory, to abolish slavery in any territory or state. So, state sovereignty, these claims about states' rights, this was a cover. This was a cover for pro-slavery Southerners' worries that the national government would claim it had the power to abolish slavery everywhere. And so they had to assert again and again and again, no it doesn't, no it doesn't, no it doesn't. It doesn't even have the power to keep slavery out of the territories. So that is one of the differences that might define this two-civilization theory. And then some people say, well, the cause of this irrepressible conflict was just slavery, pure and simple. That's why people asserted state sovereignty. It was slavery. Well, maybe, maybe not. The practice of slavery for many people was a violation of basic ideals of freedom and equality that formed the creed of many Americans. And regarding the centrality of slavery in this conflict, one can argue that slavery shaped the whole pattern of Southern culture. Southerners feared slave insurrection more than just about anything. And they were, as a consequence of that, partly as a consequence of that, less amenable to social innovations and preferred to economic change and preferred a hierarchical, authoritarian social system. So everything was orderly, and all the white people agreed that the slaves were at the bottom. And the wealthiest white men were in charge. But it was not, it was not slavery per se, because Northerners, I've said this 1,000 times, but please, please, please believe it. And if you read Uncle Tom's Cabin, and I hope you do, Antophilia demonstrates this to you. Northerners, white Northerners, most, not all, but most white Northerners believed that people of African descent were inferior, and they believed that as much as any white Southerner. They did, they just did. Just as they all believed that Native Americans were inferior to Anglo-Americans. So slavery became a symbol. It carried the freight for economic, cultural, political, constitutional, and emotional forces that contributed to the developing opposition between the North and the South. Anti-slavery sentiment in the North had been growing, especially in the 1850s, largely because of Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel. Why won't you stay there when I want you to? Oh, no, not yet. Okay. So anti-slavery sentiment in the North was growing, but let's separate anti-slavery sentiment from abolitionist sentiment. There were more and more people in the North that came to agree that, oh yes, slavery is odious. Ugh. I can't believe those people do that. But at what cost would we try to make them stop? No. Rather, what Northerners, now, some Northerners, the radical abolitionists, said, at any cost we try to make them stop. That is the only decent, virtuous thing to do. If we call ourselves Christians, we must try to extirpate slavery from this nation. Period. It doesn't matter the cost. Most white Northerners said, look, I dislike it as much as you do, but in fact, the most we can do, but this would be a really powerful thing, the most we can do is to keep slavery from expanding into the territories. And there are two really strong reasons for doing that. One, we think slavery is disgusting and immoral, but two, a lot of people in the North want to move into the Trans-Mississippi West and become commercial farmers or this or that or the other. And if they're competing with slave owners and they're unpaid laborers, they will not be able to do that. And we don't want to live in a place where there are large numbers of African Americans. So even as late as 1860, the North was as divided on the issue of slavery. Are we going to do something about slavery in the South or not? As they were united, listen, as they were united on the issue of no slavery extension, free soil, free labor, free men. So the most threatening crisis the Union had faced since 1819 had to do with whether or not slavery would be allowed to expand into the territories where there were no slaves. And these debates, these crises were not about whether or not to abolish slavery in the existing southern states. So as we try to understand whether this conflict that eventually led to this bloody and irrepressible Civil War, as we try to understand the place of slavery in this conflict, we have to remember that slavery was inextricably bound up with the economy of the North and the South, especially the North. But that also slavery was inimical to the economy and culture of the North, even though many Northerners benefited economically from slavery. Therefore, Northerners opposed the spread of slavery, cartography as a political statement. Look at this. Now, to zero in on what those God's blessing, liberty, God's curse, slavery. You see God's blessing, liberty, what that is denoting, and God's curse, slavery, is denoting the slave states. Southerners supported slavery. Of course they supported slavery. They supported slavery as a property stake in 2.5 million valuable properties, chattel, people. And they also supported slavery as an indispensable feature of an idealized social system, of white solidarity, an absence of class tension. Most whites, that means the majority. Most whites did not own slaves. at least 2/3 of all the whites in the antebellum South did not own slaves. And yet they supported slavery. They supported the people that owned slaves. They fought in the Confederacy. Many were drafted, but still. So, let's look at this northern perspective and southern perspective in 1860. Sorry. This is the idealized North. This is how the North saw itself. On the left, you see a factory, maybe it's a mill, maybe it's a textile mill, who knows. On the right, there's an independent farmer and his family. And Northerners were very proud of this because to them, this represented the results of free soil, free labor, and free men. Now, when they looked at the South, what they saw was people being sold like cattle, people being sold away from families, people living in very degrading conditions. They saw the South's, and it seemed to Northerners that the South was determined to expand slavery. They wanted to buy Cuba. Now, actually, this cartoon in the lower right, I really couldn't find a date, but I think that is a cartoon from 1898. But anyway, they wanted the Ostend Manifesto, that meeting in Belgium. They made it clear, pro-slavery Southerners made it clear, that they wanted the United States government to purchase Cuba so that it could become another slave state. Yes, that's what they wanted to do. Now, for many Southerners, this is the idealized South. Blue skies, cumulus clouds, nice houses, there's cotton, people are picking cotton, and they're putting it in bales on this wagon, and they're carrying it off, and people are talking to each other, and it's all very friendly, and it's all very pastoral. This is a diagram of the idealized South, how Southerners idealized the South. And this was, I mean, these are actual photographs. There were big plantation houses like this. There were yeoman farmer houses like this. And that was nothing, you know, if they owned their property and their farm, that was nothing to be ashamed of. You know, big gap in comfort there, but okay. But then there were also very, very poor white people that didn't own any property at all. And where the women worked all the time to try to keep food on the table and clothes on their families' backs. And they didn't own land, but they might find a little patch at the edge of somebody's property and build a little shack and hope that nobody noticed. Squatters is what they were called. Yep. Now, the Southern perspective on Northerners was that Southerners saw Northerners as coarse, ill-mannered, aggressive, materialistic Yankees. Yeah. That's how Southerners saw Northerners. And who would want to live in that kind of society? We have such a nicer rhythm of life here. We're so much more pleasant to everybody. We don't have a lot of class conflict and strikes of working people. No. Southerners emphasized the lack of commercialization in the South. And what they meant by that is that commerce wasn't a matter of impersonal relationships. It wasn't a matter of the exploitation of labor. And they referred to the exploitation of labor in northern factories as wage slaveries. And, you know, they had a point. Look at this cartoon. What fools these wage slaves be. Yeah. Now, this man, you can see that this is going around and around and around, and he's not going to be able to get off of it. And this says obedience and patience. The rungs on this are the things that he must do to continue to be a wage slave. And you see the owner of the mill, you see he's right there saying, yeah, you go, guy. You just go right on ahead. Let's see if I can. Now, this is faith. A lot of them I can't read, but this is faith. So, the idea of a wage slave was that he was obedient and he was patient and he was a good Christian. And he was just happy he could make a living, even if it was barely making a living, even if he could barely feed his children, even if he worked 12 hours a day, even if his children worked that much. Yeah, wage slavery. So, they had a point. And then, Southerners believed that Northern anti-slavery forces were flaunting, disregarding the law in terrible ways. Disregarding the fugitive slave law, obstructing the enforcement of the fugitive slave law, which Northerners saw as the extraterritoriality of slavery, Eric Foner's word. Now note this, in 1790, half of the United States population lived in the South, and slave states in 1790 outnumbered free states 8-5 in 1790. But by 1860, the North had 19 million people to the South's 12 million. And the North had almost 19 million white people to the South's 8 million white people. And in 1860, there were 18 free states and 15 slave states, with several territories, Oregon, Utah, and New Mexico, almost ready to be added to the free state list. But not one was ready to be added to the slave state list. Hence the eagerness to buy Cuba or capture Cuba or whatever. In the House of Representatives, the North had 163 members. because the House of Representatives, I'm sure you know, the number of men that represent, the number of representatives from a certain state, it depends upon the population of that state, okay? So if the North has a bigger population, there will be more people in Congress serving as congressmen, representatives. So in the House of Representatives, the North had 163 members, and the South had 85 representatives. The weakness of the South in the Electoral College had been dramatically illustrated in the 1860 election, the election of Lincoln. And these discrepancies were also reflected in comparable imbalances in financial capital, in railroad mileage, in economic strength. And that would all be very significant when these two regions went to war. And then there's growing Southern nationalism. What is nationalism? Nationalism is it is a fierce pride in one's nation. Nationalism is a recognition that this particular area is its own nation. Remember the emergence of American nationalism in the 1770s and the 1780s, and how essential that American nationalism was to the resistance against the British and to the American Revolution. Before the 1760s, the colonies, that would later be states, they had not thought of themselves as, they thought of themselves as British colonies, were part of the British Empire, but they had not thought of themselves as altogether anything different. They were primarily the colony of Virginia, the colony of New Hampshire, and so on and so on and so on. But what happens with the resistance to the British reforms is that the colonies find that they have common cause. Yes, they're very different. They're very different in many ways. But they have a common cause. And this common cause knits an identity. We are Americans. And Thomas Paine was one of the most eloquent articulators of that American identity, which was American nationalism. And in the 1850s, more and more Southern intellectuals are talking about Southern nationalism, what it means to be the South. Okay, I'll see you on Monday.